Faisal Al Yafai is chief columnist for The National. He joins me now. Thank you very much for joining us. What do you mean by snake oil?
Well, this speech by Walid Al Muallem, the foreign minister, was just him peddling this brand of Assad snake oil. The idea that they, having created the conditions for ISIL, can now provide the solution, the cure for the ailment. Absolutely ridiculous and morally repugnant. When they talk about heinous crimes, the heinous crimes that have been committed in Syria have been committed by the Assad regime over the last 3 years.
But if you look at the aim of both parties, as it were, it's the same. Can they not work on that particular issue, the ISIS issue, together?
Well, take a small example. Take Raqqa. Raqqa is this city in the northeast of Syria where ISIL have their stronghold. Now, ISIL have been flying the black flag of ISIL over Raqqa for a year. If the Assad regime wanted to destroy them, they could have done it easily, but they didn't. They went after the moderate groups, allowing ISIL to fester and grow. How can you work with such a regime?
They happened, but they didn't necessarily want that to happen, right? It's something that happens. It was an unintended consequences of what they were doing.
Well, I disagree. I don't believe that was the case. I think if you look at the evidence of them systematically...
But they don't want ISIS. They're being honest about that.
That's not true, I think. They do want ISIS. They would rather have these ungoverned spaces with extremist groups that do not target them, rather than have the foreign rebels, the FSA rebels in control.
But if it gets out of control, they've got a problem on their hands, so they want to keep a lid on it.
Sorry to interrupt. Only if ISIL turn their guns on the Assad regime, which they haven't done so far.
What do you think the strategy is with speeches like the one we had at the UN? Because they're confusing messages, aren't they? They're talking the same language as many of the coalition partners. Are they just being clever, or are they trying genuinely to get involved?
Oh no, it's just smoke and mirrors. When Walid Al Muallem talked about terrorism, he said we cannot talk about peace in Syria until we get rid of terrorism. Terrorism is the language, it's the word they've been using for 3 years to describe the rebels. It's the word they used to describe protesters who they massacred when they were calling for legitimate rights in 2011.
Despite best efforts of various powers around the world, the Syrian regime is in place, and it increasingly looks likely that it's going to stay in place. There's no major strategy to move them out. So isn't the best solution from here actually to find some way of working with them? Because the best solution for the people of that country is to find a solution to the political. Well,
my view, which I expressed in the column, is that it would be both morally repugnant to work with a regime that has slaughtered its own people, barrel bombs, rape squads, chemical weapons. Morally repugnant.
But if the strategy isn't then to go into Damascus and take them out, then surely they need to be working with them.
Sure, but there's one other point, which is that even if we sought to work with them, they would be working with us on their own terms. They have no interest in helping us create a stable Middle East. They have only an interest in keeping Bashar Al Assad in power.
In terms of the European part of the coalition, they're only involved in Iraq because they've been invited in by Iraq. Under international law, they feel that that wouldn't be acceptable in Syria. Isn't that part of the problem, though? If you said to Syria, actually invite us in, then you could have a more powerful coalition there. So that's one way in which they could work with Syria.
Perhaps. The question is whether the Assad regime would risk having troops on the ground, planes in the air above their cities. They already have it around those areas that they have lost control of. But they have it over Aleppo when the US bombed the Khorasan group. But at the moment, they haven't had this sort of coordination.
But no one's looking at boots on the ground anyway, so it would be the air mission that's similar to they've had in Iraq, where they've had more success, right?
The boots on the ground would be either the Peshmerga Kurds or the Iraqi, or perhaps the FSA.
At what point do you start engaging, though, with the Syrian regime if you're accepting that they're going to stay there? Is there anything?
There is a priori question, and that question to me is this: do we work with a murderous regime, or do we seek to remove it and replace it with something better? This is a very straightforward question. If we wanted to work with a murderous regime, we could work with ISIL. ISIL already control places and areas and cities. So if we say, well, we're going to work with whoever as long as it serves our realpolitik, then I think we could work with ISIL. But we cannot. A mutant ideology, such as the one ISIL espouses, such as the murderous ideology of Assad, cannot be negotiated.
Well, why isn't the strategy then to remove the regime?
This is a question, and I wish we could direct it to the people in the White House. It's one that I've been arguing for the last 2-3 years. It is one that should have occurred a year ago when chemical weapons were used against civilian populations.
But that would need ground troops.
It could have been done previously with a no-fly zone. Now, as the conflict on the ground has become more complicated, yes, it might involve further action.
European partners wouldn't go in on that, probably, because they wouldn't see it as legal. So it would be the US on its own. It wouldn't want to go in on its own.
Well, truthfully, these are all hypotheticals at the moment, because it is possible to find other ways of moving the conflict forward. You could perhaps have no-fly zones on the borders with Turkey. You could use the Turks in the northern part of Syria. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a rerun of what happens in Iraq. I don't expect to be able to articulate to you the strategy, because I don't especially have one. The worrying thing, though, is that neither the West nor the other Arab countries seem to have a strategy.
Okay, Faisal, thank you very much indeed.